He boarded the plane, expecting nothing more than a quiet flight home. But within minutes, a senior flight attendant decided he didn't belong in the seat he had paid for, not because of a mistake, but because of something far more dangerous. What started as a humiliating confrontation at 35,000 feet would spiral into a corporate meltdown, federal hearings, and the collapse of one of the most powerful airline executives in the country. But who was Damian Grant? Really? Why did one phone call from this calm, sharply dressed black passenger send an entire airline scrambling for survival? And how did a single incident in the sky ignite a movement that would change how millions of travelers are treated forever in this story? You'll step inside the cabin where it all began. Watch the walls close in on those who thought they could bury the truth, and see how quiet dignity can become the most unshakable force of all. Before we begin, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the moments that will have you holding your breath until the very last word. The hum of the engines was a low, steady vibration under Damian Grant's feet. The cabin smelled faintly of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread. First class on Aurora Airways. Flight 409 was exactly what the airline promised in its glossy advertisements, plush leather seats in deep navy, soft golden lighting, and attendants gliding between rows with practiced grace. Damian sat in seat 1D, the aisle seat in the first row. At 27, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he belonged anywhere he chose to be. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, the subtle sheen of the fabric catching the light whenever he moved. A slim leather laptop case rested under his seat, and a copy of The Atlantic lay folded neatly on the armrest. He didn't care much for the champagne offered before takeoff, but he appreciated the small rituals of travel, the welcome, the hot towel, the simple courtesy of being treated like every other passenger. That courtesy, however, didn't extend to him today. Marla Jennings was making her way down the aisle, blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, uniform pressed crisp enough to cut paper. Her smile seemed warm and genuine, but only for some. She leaned toward the white businessman in 1C, asking about his drink preference as though they were old friends. She bent slightly toward the elderly white woman in 2A, her voice dropping to a soft, almost maternal tone. When she reached Damian, her posture shifted, the smile faded. "Ticket," she said, extending her hand with a sharp flick of her fingers. "Of course," Damian replied evenly. He pulled his phone from the seat pocket and brought up his digital boarding pass. "Good afternoon." Marla didn't return the greeting. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, eyes scanning the barcode as though she expected it to vanish. She murmured. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" "Yes," Damian said calmly, nodding toward the number stitched into the headrest. 1D. That's what it says on the ticket. I'll also need to see your ID. Her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Damian passed over his driver's license. She compared the picture to his face, squinting slightly, then back to the ID again. "And how will you be paying for in-flight purchases?" she asked. Damian reached into his wallet and pulled out a black Orion Centurion card, the kind only issued by invitation, the kind that screamed exclusivity without a single word. He placed it gently in her palm. Marla looked at it for a moment, returned it, and moved on without offering him a drink or a towel. Damian exhaled slowly. He'd been through this before. 12 times. 100 times. Each time he weighed the cost of confrontation against the weariness of simply enduring it. As boarding finished and the doors closed, he watched Marla bustle about. She refilled the businessman's champagne without being asked. She brought the elderly woman a blanket before she even mentioned she was cold. When Damien pressed the call button for a glass of water, it was 20 minutes before she returned. When she did, she set the glass down with a sigh, as if it were an imposition. An hour into the flight, service for the meal began. Marla accidentally knocked over Damien's glass of water, soaking the edge of his laptop. "So sorry," she said, though her voice was flat. She dropped 2 cocktail napkins on the puddle and moved on. "Could I get a few more napkins?" "Please," Damien asked politely. "We're short on supplies," she said, despite a visible stack on her cart. The businessman in 1C glanced at Damien, then at Marla, his brow furrowing. That silent recognition, the acknowledgement of unfairness, seemed to tighten something in Marla's expression. When the meal finally reached Damien, it was last. His chicken was cold, the vegetables limp. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "This is a bit cold. If you have complaints about our service," Marla said loudly enough for several rows to hear, "perhaps you should fly private next time." The words were a small cut, but a cut all the same. A reminder that to her, he didn't belong here. Damien set down his fork. "May I have your full name for a customer service report?" Marla's face flushed. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," Damien replied. "I'm simply asking for your name." Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer, her voice low and sharp. "I know your type. Always looking for a handout or a lawsuit. I'd like to speak to the purser." "Please," Damien said, still calm. Something in her snapped. Perhaps it was the eyes of nearby passengers, watching. Perhaps it was the fact that Damien hadn't raised his voice, hadn't given her the outburst she seemed to want. Her hand came across his face in a blur. The sound of the slap cracked through the cabin. A sharp sting bloomed across his cheek, his lower lip splitting just enough to taste blood. "Animals like you belong in economy," she hissed. For a second, the world narrowed to the copper taste in his mouth and the burning in his cheek. Then, slowly, Damien reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and pressed the screen. The line clicked. "Dad," he said. His voice was steady, almost too steady. "It's happening again. Activate protocol Cyclone." Gasps spread through first class. Passengers whispered, hands clutching their phones. Marla's expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. She had no idea what those words meant, but Damien knew, and so did his father. Long before Damien Grant ever sat in the leather seat of Aurora Airways Flight 409, the seeds of that moment had been planted. They were sown in the cracked sidewalks of Newark, New Jersey, in the shadow of buildings where the elevators often broke and the heat in winter was never quite enough. That was where Victor Grant had grown up, the youngest of 4 children in a family that scraped by on his mother's income from cleaning offices at night and his father's job at a shipping warehouse. Victor was 12 when he first understood what the word disadvantage really meant. It was not just the absence of money. It was the presence of suspicion in the eyes of store owners when he walked in. It was the way police cars slowed down when he and his friends were on the corner. It was the closed doors before he even had a chance to knock. He worked harder than anyone, not because he thought hard work alone would save him, but because he knew he would have to outpace prejudice just to reach the starting line. At 17, he taught himself computer programming on a borrowed library book and an aging public terminal. By 23, he had secured a small loan to start a network solutions business out of a friend's basement. It was not glamorous, but it was his. Years later, Orion Systems would rise from that modest beginning into a global leader in artificial intelligence and cloud security. The headlines called him a visionary. The tech world called him a disruptor. But Victor knew that none of those titles could erase the quiet humiliations he had endured along the way. Damien was born into a different world. From the moment he came home from the hospital, it was a world of manicured lawns, private schools, and opportunities Victor could only have imagined at his age. Yet Victor also knew that money could not insulate his son from the way society still saw him. Damien's earliest memories of racism were not the kind that made the evening news. They were small moments, sharpened to a point over time. A teacher telling him his essay was too good to be his own work. A neighbor's friend asking whose child he was, assuming he could not live there. By the time Damien was in middle school, he understood that his father's wealth changed nothing about the way strangers judged him. He wore blazers to family dinners and restaurants where other black boys his age were not even in the dining room. He spoke with the kind of diction that made people say he was articulate in a tone that suggested surprise. Then came the night everything changed. Damien was 16. It was early spring in Palo Alto, the air carrying the first hint of warmth after weeks of rain. He had forgotten his house key and was trying to get in through the garage when the sirens wailed. 2 police cruisers screeched into the driveway. Before he could explain, officers had him on the ground, the rough texture of the concrete biting into his cheek. One of them pressed a knee into his back, while the other held a gun against his temple. "Move again and I'll blow your brains out." "Boy," the officer said, his voice as cold as the steel against Damien's skin. His wallet, with his ID, was in his backpack, inches away. They would not listen. They would not call his father. They were certain of who he was a threat, and they treated him accordingly. Victor arrived minutes later to find his only child face down in his own driveway. Even after producing proof of residence, the officers did not apologize. Their report later claimed Damien had been aggressive and non-compliant. The lies were almost worse than the assault itself. That night, as Victor cleaned the small cuts on Damien's face, he felt something harden inside him. He had built a billion-dollar company, advised presidents, donated millions to causes. But still, his son was one misunderstanding away from becoming another statistic. "This will never happen again," Victor said, his voice steady but laced with a fury Damien had never heard before. "Not to you. Not if I can help it." From that promise came an idea. Victor knew the systems that enabled discrimination were vast and deeply rooted. They could not be dismantled in a courtroom alone. They required a coordinated strike, legal, financial, and public, all at once. He began assembling a small, trusted network. Civil rights attorneys who could mobilize within minutes. Media strategists who could control a narrative before corporations could bury it. Investigators who could uncover patterns and records no one wanted public. He called it Protocol Cyclone. Its purpose was simple, but devastating in execution when triggered. It would not only defend against a single incident, but would expose the entire framework that allowed such an incident to occur. Contracts would be pulled. Shareholders would be pressured. Regulatory agencies would be called. Public opinion would shift before the opposing side could even draft a press release. Victor explained it to Damien like this: a cyclone doesn't just knock down one tree. It changes the whole landscape. But Damien had been reluctant to use it. In college at Harvard, he tried to blend in, to be judged by his character and not by the influence of his last name. He drove modest cars, avoided flashy clothes, and kept his head down even when confronted with subtle prejudice. "I need to fight my own battles," he told his father more than once. Victor would nod, though his eyes always held a glint of warning. Some battles are too big for one person. Sometimes you need reinforcements. Years passed without Damien ever activating the protocol. He endured being followed by security in luxury stores, being passed over for apartments despite perfect credit, being ignored by taxi drivers in the rain. He swallowed his pride, told himself he was choosing peace, and kept moving forward. But at 38,000 feet above the heartland, with the sting of Marla Jennings's handprint burning on his cheek and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, Damien knew this was different. This was not just another slight to endure in silence. This was the line his father had described, the point at which you stop absorbing the blows and start returning them. When he called Victor and spoke the words, "Activate Protocol Cyclone," he was not just making a tactical move. He was stepping into the legacy his father had built, accepting that some fights are not about pride or ego. They are about survival. And once the cyclone began, there would be no stopping it. The cabin felt different now. The low hum of conversation that usually filled first class had vanished, replaced by the faint rustle of clothing as passengers shifted in their seats. No one was quite sure what to do after what they had just witnessed. Damien remained still, his back straight, eyes forward. The warmth in his cheek had faded to a dull throb, and he could feel a faint trickle from the cut inside his lip every time he swallowed. He did not wipe it away. He let it stay there, visible, undeniable. 2 rows behind him, a young man in a navy blazer angled his phone slightly. Still recording. Across the aisle, the elderly woman in 2A leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made his jaw tighten. In the row ahead, the white businessman from 1C glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Damien's for the briefest second. There was no pity in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong. Marla Jennings stood near the galley, her hands clasped in front of her, jaw set. She was talking to another flight attendant in a low voice, darting quick glances toward Damien as if measuring her next move. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to an operational matter, we will be diverting to Chicago O'Hare. Estimated landing time is 40 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Damien knew the diversion was no coincidence. He also knew it was not just because of the slap. The words he had spoken into the phone, "Activate Protocol Cyclone," were already moving through the world outside this cabin. Marla turned toward him, her expression shifting into something halfway between annoyance and feigned authority. "Sir, the captain may need to speak with you when we land. I suggest you prepare your account of what happened." He met her gaze without blinking. "I think the captain will already know." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She spun on her heel and walked back to the galley. A passenger in 3D leaned forward, whispering, "I saw everything. If they try to twist this, I'll say what I saw." "Thank you," Damien replied quietly. He did not raise his voice, but the sincerity in his tone carried. It was not easy for people to speak up as witnesses, and he appreciated the offer. Another attendant approached with a small bottle of water and a packet of napkins. She was younger, her eyes shifting nervously toward Marla. "I'm sorry about earlier," she murmured as she handed them over. Damien nodded in thanks. "It's not your fault." She hesitated, as though she wanted to say more, then retreated down the aisle. Out the window, clouds stretched endlessly in every direction, a white ocean broken only by the distant curve of the horizon. The view should have been calming, but the tension in the cabin was so thick it almost had weight. Damien thought about his father. He pictured Victor in his study, the walls lined with framed photographs from protests, boardrooms, and award ceremonies. He imagined him leaning back in the leather chair, phone pressed to his ear, already making calls that would set the cyclone spinning. Passengers began whispering about the diversion. A woman in 4A murmured that she had a connection to catch and looked irritated. A man in 2B muttered that the airline was overreacting to a little argument. Damien ignored them. He had learned long ago that the people who minimized harm were often the ones least affected by it. The younger flight attendant reappeared, this time accompanied by a man in a pilot's uniform. He had the calm demeanor of someone used to smoothing over in-flight situations. "Mr. Grant," the pilot said softly, "I just want to make sure you're all right until we land." "I'm fine," Damien said. "Physically." The pilot nodded, glancing briefly toward Marla in the galley. "When we land, security will meet us at the gate. You'll be escorted to a private area so we can document what happened. Do you have anyone meeting you in Chicago?" "Yes," Damien said simply. The pilot's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, as though he understood there was more behind that answer, then gave a short nod and returned to the cockpit. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. Damien could see Marla moving about briskly, attending to other passengers with the same polished charm she had withheld from him. It was almost theatrical now, as if she wanted to perform her professionalism for anyone watching. But the cameras in the cabin had already captured a different performance. The businessman in 1C had his phone resting on the armrest, angled just so. The young man in the navy blazer was still recording discreetly, even without them. Damien knew at least a dozen phones had caught the moment. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed again as the plane began its descent. Chicago's sprawling grid of lights came into view below, a pale shimmer against the afternoon haze. The wheels touched down with a jolt. The cabin erupted in the familiar chorus of clicks and beeps as seatbelts came off and overhead bins popped open. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," the intercom announced. "We will be holding in position for a few minutes." Damien stayed where he was, watching as two uniformed airport security officers boarded through the forward door. They spoke briefly to the purser, then approached Marla. She stiffened, her voice rising just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is ridiculous. I've been with this airline for 18 years. I know how to handle a difficult passenger." One of the officers gestured toward the aisle. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us." As they escorted her past, she shot Damien a look that was a mixture of confusion and defiance. She still did not know exactly who he was. Damien rose slowly, collecting his laptop case. The younger attendant appeared again, gesturing toward the forward door. "This way, Mr. Grant." As he stepped into the jet bridge, the air felt cooler, sharper, carrying the faint scent of fuel. Ahead, two men in dark suits waited. One held a phone to his ear, speaking in a low voice. The other met Damien's eyes and gave a slight nod. "Mr. Grant," he said, "your transportation is ready, and your father is expecting your call." Damien felt the shift in his chest the moment when a private humiliation became a public reckoning. The cyclone had begun to spin. The private lounge at O'Hare was quieter than Damien expected. Thick carpet muffled footsteps, and the walls were lined with framed photographs of smiling executives shaking hands with celebrities. The air smelled faintly of citrus polish and expensive coffee. Outside the tall windows, planes taxied slowly across the tarmac, their tails glinting in the pale afternoon light. Damien sat in a leather armchair near the corner, his phone on the table in front of him. He could see his reflection in the dark glass of the window, the faint mark on his cheek, the small split on his lower lip. Evidence? Proof? But the videos from the cabin had already gone far beyond proof. They were a spark in a dry forest. The door opened, and two figures entered. Danielle Brooks walked in first, her stride purposeful, her dark blazer crisp and unwrinkled despite a full day of travel. She carried a slim leather folio under one arm, and her eyes scanned the room as if she were cataloging every detail. Behind her came a tall man in his 50s wearing a discreet earpiece, his presence quiet but unmistakably protective. Danielle sat across from Damien and placed the folio on the table. "Your father is on a secure line," she said, sliding her phone toward him. "But before you talk to him, you should know the protocol's already moving." Damien picked up the phone. Victor's voice came through, warm but edged with the steel. Damien knew well. "Son, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Damien said. "But you've already started, haven't you?" "Yes," Victor replied, "and so has the world. By the time you landed, the footage was on every major social media platform. We've confirmed at least 8 different angles from passengers. The audio is clear. She used the slur. She slapped you. There's no room for interpretation." Damien could picture his father in the study, surrounded by advisors, multiple screens showing news tickers and Twitter feeds. Danielle has the first phase underway. Victor continued. "Aurora Airways has already received formal notice from Orion Systems. We're suspending all corporate travel with them, effective immediately." "How much is that contract worth?" Damien asked, though he already knew. $65 million annually, Victor said. "More importantly, it's a public statement. We've also contacted 3 of their largest corporate partners. 2 have already said they're reviewing their own agreements." Danielle leaned forward. "I've also filed preliminary requests with the Department of Transportation and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for a joint investigation. This isn't just about what happened to you. We're going after their entire record." Damien nodded slowly. He had seen this before. In smaller skirmishes, his father had fought on behalf of others. The speed was the key. Hit them before they could shape the story, before their lawyers could start building walls. "What's their response so far?" Damien asked. Danielle gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Panic. The CEO, Rebecca Flores, was in a board meeting when she got the call. "From what my source tells me, she's genuinely shocked. She's new only 8 months in, and apparently had no idea the depth of their complaints file." "And Charles Redford?" Damien asked, already knowing the name. Danielle's smile vanished. "He's moving fast. He's already told their internal PR team to prepare a statement blaming the incident on a misunderstanding. He's calling you a difficult passenger who became aggressive. They're testing that narrative on a few sympathetic media contacts." Victor's voice hardened. "Let him try. Every second he spends spinning lies is another second he's not preparing for what's coming." Outside the lounge window, a large Aurora Airways jet rolled past, the company's logo catching the sun. Damien studied it for a moment. That brand had been built on promises of luxury and exceptional service. He wondered how many passengers over the years had stepped onto those planes expecting the same treatment as everyone else, only to be reminded they were exceptions to the rule. Danielle flipped open her folio, revealing a series of neatly organized documents. "Phase 2 starts tonight," she said. "We'll begin collecting formal statements from every witness on your flight. We'll also send preservation notices to Aurora's legal department so they can't accidentally delete any records." "And Phase 3? Damien asked. Danielle's eyes lit with a fierce kind of determination. "We dig deep into 10 years of complaint history, training manuals, hiring data, everything. We'll show this wasn't an isolated moment, but a pattern. Once we have that, The pressure will come from every direction: regulators, shareholders, the public. Victor's voice came through the line again, calm and deliberate. This isn't about humiliation or revenge, Damien. It's about accountability. That airline has operated with impunity for too long. If they think they can touch you without consequence, imagine how they've treated people without your resources. Damien closed his eyes for a moment, letting his father's words settle. He had tried for years to live on his own terms, without leaning on Victor's influence. But sitting here now, with the taste of dried blood still faint in his mouth, he understood what his father meant. Some fights were bigger than one person's pride. The lounge door opened again. A young woman in a tailored gray suit stepped in, holding a tablet. She approached Danielle and handed it over. "The trending data," she said quietly. Danielle scanned the screen. The hashtag is at 3 million mentions and climbing. Multiple civil rights organizations have reposted the video. Cable networks are already booking panels for tonight. Damien almost laughed at the surreal nature of it. 3 hours ago, he was just another passenger boarding a flight. Now his face was on millions of screens, the slap frozen mid-motion in endless loops. "What's the next step for me?" he asked. "For now," Danielle said, "you let the cyclone spin. We'll handle the outside. You'll meet with Dawoodi investigators tomorrow morning, give your statement, and then we start building the larger case." Victor's voice softened. "You've stepped into the storm, son. From here on, everything you do will be watched. Speak with purpose, move with intention, and remember this isn't just your fight." Damien set the phone down gently, feeling the weight of the moment. The first shockwave had hit. Contracts were suspended. The story was spreading faster than the airline could hope to contain it. Somewhere in Aurora Airways headquarters, executives were staring at plummeting stock prices and panicked emails. And this was only the beginning. The conference room in Danielle Brooks' downtown Chicago office was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. It was past midnight, but the glass walls still framed a city that seemed unwilling to sleep. Neon lights flickered in the distance, and the rhythmic swoosh of traffic far below set a steady backdrop to the work at hand. Damien sat at one end of the long mahogany table, nursing a cup of black coffee he did not need but could not refuse. Across from him, Danielle's team was a flurry of activity: laptops open, papers spread across the table, phones pressed to ears as contacts were called and records requested. A large whiteboard dominated one wall. At the top, in bold black marker, was written Aurora Airways, Incident Patterns. Underneath, the space was divided into columns labeled Passenger Complaints, Employee Records, Training Protocols, and Media Coverage. Already, each column was filling with sticky notes, handwritten numbers, and clipped news articles. A young researcher named Caleb stood up from his laptop and walked over to the board. "We've got 36 formal discrimination complaints filed with the Department of Transportation over the past 8 years, he said. "That's just what's public. My guess is the real number is at least double." Danielle looked up from her own screen. "Break them down by race, gender, and incident type. We need to show patterns." Caleb nodded and went back to typing. On the other side of the table, a paralegal named Fiona had a stack of manila folders open in front of her. "This is interesting," she said, flipping through documents. Aurora's own employee training manuals from 5 years ago have entire sections about handling high-risk passengers. But the descriptions are vague phrases like "monitor for aggressive behavior" or "watch for signs of noncompliance." When you read the examples they give, it's almost always describing passengers of color. Damien leaned forward. So the bias isn't just in practice, it's baked into the training itself. Exactly, Fiona replied. They've basically institutionalized racial profiling without saying the words. Danielle tapped her pen against the table. We'll need expert testimony to interpret that. Someone who can explain how language and corporate policy shapes employee behavior. At the far end of the room, another researcher, Maya, looked up from her dual screens. You're going to want to see this. She clicked a few keys, and the main monitor on the wall lit up with a grainy video from a security camera. It showed a crowded boarding gate from 4 years ago. A black woman in business attire was speaking to a gate agent. Though the audio was poor, the tension was obvious. Moments later, 2 airport security officers arrived, and the woman was escorted away in front of dozens of staring passengers. This was Aurora Flight 116 to Miami. Maya explained. The passenger was Dr. Renee Wallace, a cardiologist. She had a confirmed first-class ticket. The gate agent claimed her credit card didn't go through for the upgrade, even though records show it was paid weeks in advance. She filed a complaint, but the case was quietly closed. Danielle's jaw tightened. How many more like her? Maya began scrolling through a folder of clips. Too many. And notice the pattern most of the time. Aurora either blames a misunderstanding or claims the passenger was disruptive. Damien felt a familiar heaviness in his chest. These faces, these moments, they were not abstract. They were people like him. People who had boarded a plane expecting to be treated with the same dignity as anyone else, only to be reminded that some people still saw them as exceptions. Caleb returned to the board. Out of the 36 formal complaints, 19 involved passengers being downgraded or removed from first class. 14 involved being singled out for additional screening or questioning without cause. 3 involved physical contact from staff. Fiona added, and guess what? Not a single one of those complaints resulted in a public apology from Aurora. The most they've done is issue private vouchers for future travel, the kind that expires in 6 months. Danielle stood, walking slowly to the whiteboard. She studied the notes for a long moment before speaking. We are going to show this isn't just about Damien. This is about a culture that trains its people to suspect, to confront, to humiliate, and then to cover its tracks. Damien glanced at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. The exhaustion was there, but it was threaded with something sharper, a sense of clarity. This was why Protocol Cyclone existed, not for headlines or revenge, but for exactly this, pulling the curtain back on an entire system. Danielle turned to him. Tomorrow morning, we'll send preservation demands for all internal communications regarding passenger conduct. That includes emails, texts, Slack channels, everything. We'll subpoena complaint records from all major airports they operate in. And we'll reach out to every person who's ever gone public with their story, Maya added. We've already contacted Dr. Wallace. She said she'd be willing to speak to the press, especially if this leads to real change. Damien nodded. Good. If we make this just about me, they'll paint it as an isolated incident. If we make it about everyone, they'll have nowhere to hide. Danielle's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing. It's Victor. She put the call on speaker. Victor's voice was calm but urgent. I just got word from one of our media contacts Aurora's stock dropped 7% in after-hours trading. That's before the morning news cycle. By noon tomorrow, this will be the lead story on every major network. Fiona smiled faintly. They'll have investors breathing down their necks before lunch. Victor continued, Be ready for them to push back hard. They may try to discredit witnesses or leak selective parts of the video. Don't let them shift the narrative, Danielle assured him. We've got multiple unedited angles. Even if they try, it'll backfire. Damien looked around the room, at the whiteboard covered in evidence, the glow of laptop screens, the team working past midnight because they believed in the fight. He thought about the slap. The sound of it still echoed in his mind, but now it was layered with other sounds, the clicking of keyboards, the soft murmur of strategy, the hum of an entire operation turning against the force that had humiliated him. Victor's voice softened before ending the call. Son, remember they think they can weather this. Make sure they can't. When the call ended, Danielle clapped her hands lightly to refocus the room. All right, we keep digging. No stone unturned. By the time we're done, Aurora Airways won't just have a PR problem. They'll have a survival problem. Damien leaned back in his chair, the weight of fatigue pressing down on him. Yet beneath it all, there was a quiet satisfaction. The past was coming to light. The storm was building, and the airline that thought it could bury a moment of prejudice was about to be buried under years of its own history. Morning light spilled into the Chicago skyline, turning the glass towers into sheets of gold. Damien sat at the edge of the hotel bed, phone in hand, scrolling through the endless feed of headlines and notifications. Every major outlet had picked it up. Black venture capitalist slapped in first class by Aurora Airways. Flight attendant viral video sparks calls for airline boycott civil rights groups. Demand investigation. After onboard assault. The video was everywhere. On some clips, the slap played in slow motion. The sound sharpened so the impact cracked through speakers. Others froze the moment right after, when Damien's head had turned slightly and his eyes had locked on Marla Jennings. The commentary beneath ranged from outrage to disbelief. Victor had called twice already that morning, his tone steady but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. "They're drowning," he said in the last call, and the current just picked up. Downstairs in the hotel conference suite, Danielle Brooks' team was already working. The air buzzed with energy. The long table was covered with laptops, coffee cups, and stacks of printed articles. Screens mounted on the walls streamed live news coverage from 3 different networks. Danielle stood near the center, phone pressed to her ear, one hand resting on the back of a chair. "Yes, we have multiple eyewitness statements," she said to someone on the other end. "And yes, we have the original, unedited files. You'll get them when we go public at noon." She hung up and turned to Damien. "CNN wants you live at 1 p.m., she said. "We'll do it remotely from here. Just be ready, they're going to ask about your father, your company, and whether you plan to sue." "I'll be ready," Damien said. He had been trained since childhood to handle questions under pressure. But this felt different. This was not a product launch or a market interview. This was personal. Maya approached with a tablet in hand. "You should see this." She tapped the screen, revealing a live segment from a morning news show. The anchor was interviewing Dr. Renee Wallace, the cardiologist from the old Aurora incident. She spoke calmly, her voice measured but firm. "This is not a one-off, Doctor," Wallace said. "This is a pattern. I experienced it. Others have." The airline's response is always the same. Deny, deflect, minimize. But now, thanks to Mr. Grant's courage and the power of social media, they can't hide. The anchor nodded gravely. "Do you believe this will lead to real change?" "I believe it can." "Doctor," Wallace replied, "if enough people refuse to look away." Damien felt a small surge of gratitude. He had never met her in person. But in this fight, she was an ally. Across the room, Caleb was updating a large projection chart showing Aurora Airways stock price. The line was a steep downward slope. "They're down 12% since yesterday," he reported. "That's over $1 billion in market cap wiped out in less than 24 hours, Fiona chimed in. "And they're bleeding in the press. The New York Times is running an investigative piece tomorrow on their history of discrimination claims. We fed them everything we verified." Danielle looked at Damien. "By tonight. They'll either have to apologize or double down. If they apologize, it opens the door to negotiations. If they double down, we go full throttle and hit Phase 3 early." "What's Phase 3 again?" Damien asked, though he already knew. Danielle's lips curved into a thin, knowing smile. "Regulatory chokehold. We'll have the FAA and the DOT combing through every operational policy they've got. We'll push for federal hearings. If they think this is bad now, wait until their legal department is working 20-hour days just to respond to subpoenas." At 11:45, Danielle called for a final prep before the noon press release. "Once this drops, the next 6 hours will decide the public narrative. Damien, your job is to stay composed, stay factual, and keep the focus on the bigger issue. This is about the culture that allowed this to happen, not just one employee." He nodded, understood. Noon came like the flick of a switch. Danielle's press release went live, complete with video stills, a summary of eyewitness statements, and a detailed outline of Aurora's documented history of similar complaints. Within minutes, it was picked up by wire services, and push notifications began lighting up phones across the country. By 12:30, hashtags tied to the incident were trending at #1 nationwide. Celebrities, politicians, and public figures began weighing in. One tweet from a prominent civil rights leader read, "This is not just a passenger story. This is a justice story. Damien Grant's dignity is our dignity." At 1 p.m. Damien sat in the small studio room the hotel had set up for the CNN interview. A ring light cast an even glow across his face, and an earpiece connected him to the producers in Atlanta. When the anchor's voice came through, it was warm but direct. "Mr. Grant, thank you for joining us. Millions have now seen the video. Can you walk us through what happened on that flight?" Damien spoke clearly, his tone steady. He described boarding, the confrontation, the slap. He did not embellish, did not raise his voice. He let the facts speak. "And what was your immediate reaction afterward?" The anchor asked. "I made a call to my father." Damien said, "Not to seek revenge, but to ensure accountability. No one should be treated differently because of the color of their skin or the assumptions someone makes about their worth." The anchor leaned in slightly, even through the screen. "Aurora Airways has not yet issued a public apology. What do you hope happens next?" "I hope they take a hard look at their culture," Damien replied, "and I hope they make changes that last. This is about more than me. It's about every passenger who has ever been made to feel they don't belong in a seat they rightfully hold." When the interview ended, Danielle gave him a rare, approving nod. "That," she said, "is how you keep control of a story." By late afternoon, the ripple effects had reached Washington. A senator from Illinois released a statement calling for a congressional inquiry into discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. The DOT confirmed they were opening an investigation into Aurora Airways training protocols. Fiona received a message from one of her contacts. Aurora's legal department had been instructed to prepare for significant operational disruption if the regulatory probes expanded. At 5 p.m., Rebecca Flores, the CEO of Aurora Airways, finally appeared on camera for a brief statement. She expressed regret over the incident and said the airline was conducting an internal review, but she stopped short of apologizing to Damien by name. "That's not going to cut it," Danielle said flatly as the clip ended. "They're still protecting themselves first." Damien sat back, watching the coverage play on a loop. He knew this was not the climax. It was only the rising tide before the break. The media storm was in full force, and Aurora Airways was scrambling to find its footing. But the ground beneath them was already eroding. Tomorrow would be worse for them, and Damien intended to make sure of it. The first sign of Aurora Airways' pushback came just after sunrise the next morning. Damien was sipping coffee in the hotel suite, the television tuned to a national morning show, when the anchor introduced a breaking statement from the airline's executive vice president of operations, Charles Redford. On screen, Redford stood at a podium in front of a blue Aurora Airways banner. His suit was immaculate, his expression smooth, almost casual. "While we regret the events that occurred aboard Flight 482," Redford began, "we want to clarify that there are conflicting accounts of the incident. Our preliminary investigation suggests that the passenger in question was verbally aggressive toward crew members and refused to comply with standard seating procedures. The flight attendant involved has an exemplary record spanning over 20 years. Damien set his coffee down slowly. There it was, the narrative shift. Redford went on. "Aurora Airways remains committed to providing a safe and welcoming environment for all passengers. We ask the public to reserve judgment until all facts are known." Danielle Brooks walked in just as the segment ended. She had already seen it. "They're trying to smear you without saying your name," she said. "Calling you verbally aggressive is code. They're planting doubt, making it sound like you provoked this." Damien shook his head. "They know the footage shows the truth, but they also know not everyone will watch it. They're targeting the people who just read headlines," Danielle said. "We can't let that stick." Within an hour, Protocol Cyclone's war room was buzzing. Caleb was tracking media hits. "The statement's already on half the major news sites," he said. "Some are running it uncritically." Fiona had been digging into Marla Jennings' history. "Exemplary record," she said with a dry laugh. "I've found 3 internal complaints about her behavior toward passengers, all in the last 6 years. None escalated because they were labeled informal. And here's the kicker. One of the complainants was a pilot's wife. That," Danielle said, "is going in our next press packet." By mid-morning, Aurora's strategy became even clearer. Anonymous sources began feeding reporters selective bits of supposed witness accounts claiming Damien had been hostile before the slap. Danielle recognized the fingerprints of a coordinated PR defense. At 10:30, Victor called, "They're gambling. They can tarnish you just enough to muddy the waters. That way, if it comes down to a legal fight, it looks like 2 sides telling different stories instead of one side telling the truth." Damien exhaled slowly. "Then we don't just defend. We go on offense." That was the cue Danielle had been waiting for. "I've got 2 major stories ready to drop," she said. "One is an op-ed from Dr. Renee Wallace connecting your experience to a larger pattern of discrimination in the industry. The other is an investigative piece we've been working on with the New York Times that lays out 10 years of Aurora complaints, complete with names, dates, and outcomes. Drop them both," Damien said. Noon arrived, and the first wave hit. Dr. Wallace's op-ed went live on a major news site. Her words were calm but razor-sharp, dismantling the idea that isolated incidents could be brushed aside. "If you think this is rare," she wrote, "it's only because the stories that don't go viral vanish into silence. At 12:15, the Times piece landed. The headline was damning Aurora Airways' quiet record of passenger discrimination. Inside were detailed accounts of incidents eerily similar to Damien's, including 3 in which passengers were physically touched or removed from seats without justification. Social media lit up, the hashtag surged again. Public sentiment swung harder against the airline. But Aurora did not retreat. By late afternoon, they aired a pre-recorded interview with Marla Jennings. She sat in what looked like a cozy living room, wearing a soft cardigan instead of her uniform. Her voice was calm, tinged with what sounded like practiced sadness. "I've served thousands of passengers over my career," she said. "I've always tried to treat everyone with kindness. That day was chaotic. The passenger became upset, and I reacted in a way I wish I could take back, but I never intended harm." Danielle muted the television. There it is, the sympathy play. They want her to look like the kindly veteran being unfairly attacked. Damien watched the screen for a long moment. She's lying without lying. She's framing it as a reaction to my supposed behavior, not an unprovoked act. Caleb reported another development. Aurora's stock is stabilizing a bit. That statement from Redford and the interview with Jennings is buying them some breathing room, but the comments online are still brutal. Fiona looked up from her laptop. "We can crack their breathing room. Remember those 3 complaints against Jennings? One of them was about her making a racial remark to a passenger who asked for help with a heavy bag. If that passenger is willing to talk," Danielle's eyes narrowed. "Find them." An hour later. Fiona returned with a grin. "Got her. Lives in Atlanta now. She's furious this woman is being painted as a saint. She's willing to go on record." That night, the woman's interview aired on an independent news channel. She recounted how Jennings had rolled her eyes, refused to assist, and muttered under her breath that she should know her place all within earshot of other passengers. The counterattack from Aurora began to wobble. Their defense still played on the air, but now it competed with a chorus of credible voices dismantling it in real time. Damien sat in the hotel lounge that evening, phone buzzing with constant updates. A part of him hated how public this had all become. His name was in headlines he never asked for, his face tied to a slap that would follow him for years. But another part of him recognized the power in the moment. He thought about his father's words. Make sure they can't weather this. The airline had chosen to fight, to protect its image instead of its integrity. That meant the storm would only get worse. Before turning in for the night, Damien sent Danielle a message. "Tomorrow, we go bigger. If they want a war, we'll give them one they can't win." She replied within seconds, already in motion. The counterattack had begun. But Damien knew something Aurora Airways did not. They were playing defense against a team that had no intention of stopping until the system itself was forced to change. The morning after Aurora's counterattack, Danielle Brooks arrived at the hotel suite before sunrise. She moved with the calm focus of someone who had not only planned the next move, but was already thinking 2 steps ahead of that. Damien was at the dining table, laptop open, scrolling through an internal report Caleb had sent over just minutes earlier. It was a bombshell. "I think we've got it," Damien said as she walked in. "This is from their own HR department, a memo to senior leadership about elevated passenger grievances in premium cabins. Look at the breakdown." Danielle scanned the document. More than 70% of the complaints in the last 3 years had come from first-class or business-class passengers of color. Now many involved sudden seat changes, luggage disputes, or accusations of non-compliance. "This is gold," she said, "but it's only useful if we can verify it came from inside." Caleb entered, holding 2 phones. Already working on it. My contact at the FAA says this memo was part of an internal safety audit they conducted last year. If we can get them to confirm, we can release it without worrying about being accused of fabricating evidence. Fiona looked up from her laptop at the far end of the room. And I just got something else. A copy of an internal Slack conversation between Charles Redford and Rebecca Flores. They're discussing you. Damien not by name, but it's obvious saying, this passenger incident will blow over like the others if we keep the crew's statements aligned. Damien leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. So they're already treating this as damage control. Not a problem to solve. That's exactly the point we're going to make, Danielle said. We'll show the public that Aurora isn't just mishandling individual cases. They have a corporate culture that's hostile to accountability. The next step was delicate. Danielle knew that releasing internal documents too early could spook potential whistleblowers still inside the company. She called the team together and mapped out a phased leak strategy. Phase 1 released the HR grievance memo anonymously to a trusted investigative journalist, ensuring it would be cross-checked before publication. Phase 2, hold the Slack exchange until the media cycle was primed, then use it to shatter whatever trust remained in Aurora's leadership. By mid-morning, Caleb had sent the grievance memo to a journalist at the Chronicle, a publication known for its meticulous fact-checking. The reporter promised to confirm it with at least 2 sources before running the piece. Meanwhile, Fiona reached out to a former Aurora HR manager who had left the company 6 months earlier. She was hesitant at first, but after hearing Damien's name and the details of the incident, she agreed to talk on record. This is not surprising to me, the former manager said in a call later that afternoon. We were told to manage complaints quietly. There was an unspoken rule if the passenger was in first class and not white. Look for any justification to downgrade them or document them as disruptive if they pushed back. The room went silent as the weight of her words settled. Danielle's expression hardened. We have her statement, we have the memo, and we have the conversation between Redford and Flores. That's the trifecta. Damien looked from one face to another. Then let's break them apart from the inside. If leadership starts doubting each other, their public front will collapse. That night, Danielle made a private call to a mid-level Aurora executive she had represented years earlier in an unrelated labor dispute. His voice was wary but curious. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal, she said. I'm telling you that your leadership is sitting on a crisis that could take down the airline. And when it happens, they'll sacrifice whoever they need to in order to survive. Do you want to be on the right side of this? There was a long pause. What do you need? He finally asked. The next morning, a package arrived at the hotel. Inside was a printed binder labeled Internal Incident Report, Flight 482. It was the official account Aurora's leadership had compiled, and it was riddled with inconsistencies. Crew statements contradicted each other on key details, like Damien's alleged verbal aggression and whether he had refused instructions. One crew member even admitted she never heard the exchange between Damien and Marla Jennings, but had been told by another attendant what to say in her report. This, Danielle said, holding the binder up, is what will make their lawyers sweat. The Chronicle ran the grievance memo story later that afternoon. The headline was blunt. Aurora Airways internal data shows disproportionate complaints against passengers of color. The article cited multiple former employees confirming the numbers and describing a culture of silent bias in premium cabins. Aurora's PR team tried to respond, but the damage was instant. Stock prices slid another 3%. Civil rights groups renewed calls for a boycott. 2 hours later, Danielle timed the release of the Slack exchange. Screenshots flooded social media. showing Redford and Flores casually discussing the need to keep the crew aligned so the incident would fade. Public trust began to crack. By evening, Victor Grant called Damien. They're bleeding from every hole now. The market's losing confidence, and more importantly, so is their staff. Expect resignations. He was right. That night, a junior operations manager at Aurora posted an open letter on LinkedIn criticizing the leadership's handling of discrimination complaints. She resigned in protest, and her post went viral, shared by thousands within hours. Damien read her words twice. She had no obligation to speak out, but she had done it anyway. The courage in that moved him more than he expected. "This is how it happens," Danielle said when she saw his expression. "The weak links stop covering for the strong ones. And when the inside turns against the top falls faster than anyone expects." Damien knew the storm was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like Aurora Airways wasn't just under fire from the outside. The cracks were spreading inward, and cracks, once deep enough, could shatter the whole structure. The hotel suite was still when Damien woke. Outside, the Chicago morning carried the muted hum of traffic, but inside, there was a heavy anticipatory quiet. He stepped into the main room to find Danielle at the table, her laptop open, a steaming cup of tea untouched beside her. "They're about to lose control," she said without looking up. Her voice was even, but her eyes had the sharp focus of someone who saw exactly where the fault lines were about to split. Caleb appeared from the adjoining room, holding his phone like it was a live wire. "We just got something from our FAA contact. You need to see this." On the screen was a PDF stamped confidential. The title read, "Aurora Airways, Internal Training Compliance Audit 2023. It detailed multiple violations of federal requirements, including failure to conduct proper anti-discrimination training for cabin crews. At least 2 of the violations were tied directly to premium cabin service. Fiona leaned over Caleb's shoulder. "This is the crack. Once this is out, they cannot claim they've been proactive. They've been in violation for over a year." Danielle closed her laptop with a slow, deliberate motion. "We do not just leak this. We build a story around it. If we drop it without context, it's just another scandal headline. If we drop it with the right framing, it becomes the moment the public stops giving them the benefit of the doubt." Damien felt the tension rising. "And the right framing is that they knew about the problem," Danielle said, and chose to ignore it. "That they saw the data, saw the patterns, and made a calculated decision to do nothing." Maya came in from the balcony, earbuds in, phone in hand. "You're going to want to hear this," she said. She tapped her phone, and a voice recording played. It was a man's voice, weary, deliberate. "They told us not to overreact to passenger complaints in premium cabins. They said most of them were exaggerations from people looking for free upgrades or refunds. But what they really meant was, if the passenger wasn't white, don't escalate it unless you absolutely had to." "Who is that?" Damien asked. "Senior cabin manager," Maya said. "Still employed there. He left me that message an hour ago. He says he's willing to talk if we can guarantee protection." Danielle's eyes lit briefly. "We can, and if he's willing to go on record. This is over for Aurora's leadership." By mid-morning, the team was in full motion. Fiona drafted a sworn affidavit for the cabin manager to sign. Caleb began cross-referencing the training violations in the audit with specific incidents and passenger complaint records. At noon, Damien's phone buzzed with a call from his father. Victor's voice carried the calm weight of experience. "You're about to hit them harder than they've ever been hit. But remember, the point isn't just to win, The point is to change the system so they can't do this to someone else. Damien felt that settle in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been quietly dismissed, downgraded, or humiliated without anyone noticing. At 2 p.m., the Chronicle agreed to run a special feature on the audit violations. Danielle coordinated the timing so that within minutes of publication, the sworn statement from the senior cabin manager would also be released through a separate outlet. When it hit, it was like a shockwave. Headlines blared. Aurora Airways ignored federal training requirements for over a year. Subhead whistleblower claims discriminatory practices were encouraged in premium cabins. News networks cut into regular programming. The whistleblower's voice was played on loop, his words damning in their clarity. In every clip, the connection was made to Damien's incident not as an isolated event, but as the predictable result of a broken system. Aurora's initial response was frantic. A hastily written statement claimed the audit results were outdated and in the process of being addressed. But within an hour, an FAA spokesperson went on record contradicting them, confirming that the violations were still active and under investigation. Inside Aurora's headquarters, chaos was spilling into public view. An anonymous source leaked an email chain showing heated arguments among top executives about who was responsible for the violations. One executive accused another of burying the audit results to avoid costly retraining programs. By early evening, the story had escalated beyond Aurora Airways. Several senators publicly called for hearings on discrimination in air travel, specifically naming Damien's case as the catalyst. The DOT announced that it would expand its review to all major carriers. Danielle watched the coverage from the hotel suite. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is their breaking point. They can't spin their way out of a federal investigation." Damien sat beside her, watching as his name appeared in the lower third of the screen under the headline, "Passenger's Case Sparks National Review of Airline Practices." It felt surreal the incident had begun as a personal injustice, and now it was pulling an entire industry into the light. Maya was still fielding calls from reporters, arranging interviews with former Aurora employees willing to share their stories. Caleb was tracking online sentiment, noting that public support for Damien had surged even higher since the whistleblower's statement. Then, just after 9 p.m., came the most dramatic turn of the day. Rebecca Flores, the CEO of Aurora Airways, announced an emergency press conference for the following morning. The official reason was to address recent reports and reaffirm the company's commitment to its passengers. Danielle smirked. That means they're either about to offer a public apology, or they're going to make one last stand. Either way, it's going to be the most watched moment of her career. Damien knew what that meant. If she apologized, it could signal a shift. But if she doubled down, the pressure would only intensify. Before heading to bed, Damien walked to the suite's large windows and looked out at the city lights. He thought about the countless people whose stories would never make the news, about how many had simply endured the humiliation because fighting back felt impossible. He had been given resources, a platform, and a team willing to fight alongside him. Most did not have that. That realization deepened his resolve. This was no longer just about Aurora Airways. It was about making sure the system itself could not hide behind polished statements and corporate spin. Tomorrow could bring the apology the world expected, or it could bring the final act of defiance from a leadership too arrogant to change. Either way, Damien was ready. The morning of the press conference broke cold and gray over Chicago. Damien was up early, unable to sleep past 5. He stood by the window of the suite, watching the faint glow on the horizon as the city slowly came alive. Behind him, the television was already on, muted, showing aerial shots of Aurora Airways headquarters where reporters and camera crews were gathering. Danielle came in from her room carrying a folder and her phone. "It's starting in less than 2 hours. We need to be ready for both outcomes." "Both outcomes?" Damien asked. "She either folds and apologizes, or she doubles down," Danielle said, setting the folder on the table. "If she apologizes, we respond cautiously. If she doubles down, we drop the final set of documents and make sure she doesn't get to control the day." Fiona was typing rapidly at her laptop, finalizing talking points for media inquiries. Caleb was scanning social media trends, noting that the hashtags connected to Damien's case were still climbing. At 8:30, live coverage began. Rebecca Flores walked onto the stage in a tailored navy suit, flanked by 2 senior executives. Her face was composed, but Damien noticed the stiffness in her movements. She stepped up to the podium. "Good morning. I want to address the recent allegations against Aurora Airways and the incident involving one of our valued passengers." She paused, letting the cameras capture the moment. For a second, Damien thought she might offer a genuine apology, but then her tone shifted. "While we acknowledge that the passenger's experience was regrettable, it is important to understand that our crew acted within the guidelines provided to ensure the safety and comfort of all travelers. The narrative being presented in the media does not reflect the full context of the situation." Danielle exhaled sharply. "She's doubling down," Flores continued. "Aurora Airways has always been committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Any suggestion that we encourage discriminatory practices is simply false. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities to resolve any misunderstandings." The words misunderstandings and false hung in the air like smoke. She wasn't apologizing. She was framing the whistleblower and the documents as misinterpretations. Damien sat back slowly. "Then we do it." Danielle didn't hesitate. She gave Caleb a quick nod. He tapped a few keys and sent the final packet of documents to 3 major news outlets simultaneously. Inside were detailed reports from internal safety committees, records of complaints that had been downgraded without investigation, and a confidential memo from Charles Redford instructing managers to streamline passenger incident reports in premium cabins to reduce noise in the system. 5 minutes after Flores left the podium, the first story hit. By the time she reached her office, the headlines were everywhere. Aurora Airways, memos reveal, direct orders to downplay, passenger complaints. The press conference that was supposed to steady the company had detonated into another crisis. Reporters swarmed the headquarters lobby demanding answers. Inside the hotel suite, Maya was on a call with one of her contacts inside Aurora. "They're in full meltdown," she said after hanging up. "Redford is blaming Flores for holding the press conference. Flores is blaming him for the memos. Security had to clear the executive floor because voices were carrying into the hallway." Danielle leaned against the table, watching the chaos unfold on live television. "This is the beginning of the end for this leadership team. They've lost control of the narrative, and now they're losing control of themselves." Damien watched silently. A part of him felt a grim satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't over. Aurora Airways could still try to salvage itself by sacrificing individuals. The question was whether they would stop at Marla Jennings or go all the way to the top. By midday, the first resignation came. A vice president in charge of training programs submitted her letter, citing irreconcilable differences with current leadership. The media framed it as the first domino. Then, late in the afternoon, an unverified video began circulating online. It appeared to be shot inside a closed-door meeting. Rebecca Flores was visible at the head of a long conference table. Her voice raised. "We are not going to let one passenger dictate the future of this airline," she said, slamming her hand on the table. "We will outlast him." The clip went viral within an hour. The optics were disastrous. The CEO not only refusing accountability, but positioning herself against a paying passenger. Victor Grant called Damien shortly after. "You've got her. She's making it personal, and that's a mistake. Once a leader does that in public, they lose the ability to claim neutrality." That evening, Danielle gathered the team. "We need to think about the final phase. They're spiraling. But if we want this to mean something beyond Aurora Airways, we need to push for structural change. The DOT hearings are going to happen. We make sure they include policy recommendations that will change how airlines handle passenger complaints." Damien nodded. "And we make sure those recommendations have teeth. Real enforcement, not just language about improvement." As the night wore on, the media narrative solidified. The press conference had been a failure. The leaked documents had destroyed any credibility left in Aurora's leadership, and public opinion had swung decisively against the airline. From his hotel window, Damien looked out at the city lights, feeling the exhaustion of the past days settle over him. But beneath it was something stronger, the knowledge that they were closer than ever to forcing real change. Tomorrow would bring new headlines, new maneuvers, and possibly new attacks. But after watching Rebecca Flores' last stand crumble in real time, Damien knew the end game was in sight. The morning after Rebecca Flores' failed press conference felt different. The air in the hotel suite was charged, as if everyone could sense that something irreversible had been set in motion. The television played muted news coverage while Caleb scrolled through financial updates. "Aurora's stock dropped another 12% overnight," he said. "Analysts are openly questioning if Flores can survive the week." Fiona looked up from her laptop. "There are rumors of an emergency board meeting today. No one will confirm it, but 3 different sources inside say they are preparing to vote on her removal." Damien poured himself coffee, his mind turning over the implications. Removing Flores would be a public concession, but it wouldn't necessarily change the culture that had created this problem in the first place. Danielle walked in, phone to her ear, listening intently. She ended the call and set it down. That was a contact from the DOT. "The hearings are being fast-tracked. They want testimony from you, Damien, within the next week. They are also calling former and current Aurora employees." That shifted the mood instantly. This was no longer just a media battle. Now it was a formal investigation with the weight of the federal government behind it. By late morning, the first on-camera resignation landed. Charles Redford appeared in a shaky live stream from his home office, reading a prepared statement. "I am stepping down from my role at Aurora Airways effective immediately. While I maintain that I acted in good faith, I recognize that the trust of our passengers and employees has been compromised." Danielle watched the feed closely. He's trying to protect himself from legal fallout, but this will only make Flores look more isolated. The domino effect began. Within hours, 2 more senior executives announced their departures. Leaked memos from within the company revealed that mid-level managers were openly debating whether to cooperate with investigators to protect themselves. Maya came in from the balcony, phone in hand. "You're going to want to see this." She handed it to Damien. On the screen was a new viral post from the junior operations manager who had resigned days earlier. She had obtained and published a list of more than 50 passenger complaints Aurora had internally marked as resolved despite no investigation being conducted. Many of the complaints involved premium cabin passengers of color. The comments section exploded with people sharing their own experiences. Some described being downgraded for security reasons with no explanation. Others recounted being accused of taking items from service carts or being spoken to as if they did not belong. Damien read them all, each one a small piece of a much larger truth. It was no longer just about his case. This was a pattern, decades in the making, finally coming into the light. By early afternoon, cameras outside Aurora headquarters captured board members arriving one by one, faces tight, avoiding questions. Speculation ran wild. Inside the suite, Danielle kept her attention on the television while Caleb worked on a briefing for Damien's upcoming testimony. "If they remove Flores today," she said, "we respond publicly but cautiously. We make it clear that this is a start, not an ending." At 3:15, the news broke. Aurora's board had voted to remove Rebecca Flores as CEO, effective immediately. The official statement was Kurt Aurora Airways. "Thanks, Ms. Flores, for her years of service and wishes her the best in her future endeavors." There was no mention of the ongoing investigation, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Danielle turned off the television. "They think this will stop the bleeding. They are wrong." Damien felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, this was accountability in real time. On the other, it was far from justice. The system that had enabled this still stood. Reporters immediately began calling the suite, requesting Damien's reaction. Danielle drafted a statement that struck a measured tone. While leadership changes are a necessary step, true accountability requires systemic reform. We look forward to working with investigators to ensure that the rights and dignity of all passengers are protected. That evening, the news cycle was dominated by footage of Flores leaving the building surrounded by security, avoiding every question shouted her way. Her fall from power was complete, but Aurora's survival was still in question. Victor Grant called just before dinner. "You handled this exactly right," he said. "By keeping your focus on the bigger picture, you've made it impossible for them to spin this as a personal feud." Damien appreciated the words, but his mind was already on the DOT hearings. He thought of the faces of people in the complaint records, most of them just trying to get from one place to another when they were treated like they did not belong. The next morning, Danielle gathered the team for a strategy session. "We have the floor at the hearings. We are going to use it. Damien will speak first, laying out the incident and connecting it to the larger patterns. Then we bring in supporting witnesses. We show this is not about one bad flight, or one bad crew, or one bad CEO. This is about a system that rewards bias when it's hidden and punishes it only when it's exposed," Maya added. "We also bring visuals, charts showing the percentage of unresolved complaints by race and cabin class, copies of training audit violations, whistleblower statements. The more tangible we make it, the harder it will be for anyone to dismiss." Damien nodded slowly. He felt the weight of what was coming, but also the clarity. This was the moment to turn a personal ordeal into something that could alter policy for years to come. As night fell, the city lights reflected on the glass windows of the suite. Damien stood looking out, aware that the fight was shifting into its final stage. Aurora's leadership had collapsed, but the system they represented was still standing, and he intended to be there when the first cracks spread through that system too. The hearing room in Washington was brighter than Damien expected. The overhead lights reflected off polished wood and rows of microphones, giving the entire space a sterile clarity that left no room for shadows. Cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights steady, and reporters sat shoulder to shoulder in the press section. Danielle stood beside him near the front, adjusting the single sheet of paper he would use for his opening remarks. "You know what you're here to do," she said quietly. "Tell them the truth in a way that makes it impossible for them to ignore." When the committee chair called his name, Damien stepped forward. The room settled into silence. broken only by the faint clicking of camera shutters. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak," Damien began. His voice was steady, but the gravity of the moment pressed against him. "I am here not just because of what happened to me, but because what happened to me is part of a larger pattern. A pattern of treating some passengers as if they are privileges to be granted, and others as if they are inconveniences to be managed." He recounted the events of that flight in precise detail. How Marla Jennings approached him in first class with the assumption he did not belong. How she refused to check the manifest until another passenger intervened. How the incident was escalated against him rather than the crew member who initiated it. Then he shifted. "I have learned since that day that my experience is not unique. Documents from Aurora Airways show a consistent failure to investigate passenger complaints, particularly those from travelers of color in premium cabins. Training audits reveal that mandated anti-discrimination programs were ignored for over a year. Whistleblowers have testified that bias was not only tolerated, but operationally streamlined." He paused to let the words settle. "If we leave this room without structural change, then all we have done is trade one scandal for the next. I am asking you to establish enforcement measures that make it costly to ignore complaints, to mandate transparent tracking of incident resolution, and to hold executives accountable when their policies harm passengers." When Damien finished, the chair nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. Your testimony will be entered into the official record." Next came the witnesses. Danielle had prepared. A former Aurora flight attendant described subtle instructions to avoid escalation when premium passengers of color raised concerns. Dr. Renee Wallace spoke about being accused of attempting to access a cabin she had paid for in full, only to be publicly humiliated in front of other passengers. The committee members leaned forward, asking sharp, pointed questions. How were these incidents recorded? What percentage of complaints were closed without action? How many executives had seen the training audit before it was leaked? By the time the hearing adjourned, it was clear that this was more than a review of one airline. The committee announced its intent to introduce legislation to reform complaint handling and anti-bias training across the entire industry. Outside the hearing room, reporters crowded the steps. Damien spoke briefly, reiterating that while leadership changes at Aurora were a start, the real victory would be measured by how the industry treated its passengers moving forward. Back in Chicago, the news spread quickly. Headlines read, "Congress considers airline passenger Bill of Rights." After discrimination hearings, public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for stricter regulations on airline conduct. Aurora Airways, now under interim leadership, issued a statement agreeing to adopt the reforms once passed into law. But Damien knew their agreement was strategic. They wanted to position themselves as cooperative before the tide of public opinion swept them further under. Weeks passed. The bill, unofficially dubbed the Grant Passenger Dignity Act, gained bipartisan support. It required airlines to maintain transparent records of all passenger complaints, mandated annual anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff, and imposed significant fines for unresolved violations. It also gave passengers the right to an independent review if they believed they were targeted because of race, gender, or religion. When the bill passed, Damien read the text carefully. He thought of the faces he had seen in the complaint records, of the people whose names would never make headlines, but whose dignity had been taken from them in small, quiet moments. This was for them. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Damien boarded a flight for the first time since the incident. It was the same airline, but the atmosphere felt different. The crew greeted him warmly, verified his boarding pass without hesitation, and offered assistance without assumption. Danielle, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned and smiled. "You changed more than you realize," she said. Damien leaned back in his seat, letting the hum of the engines fill the space between them. "We changed it," he replied, "all of us who refused to stay quiet." As the plane lifted off, he looked out at the clouds below. For the first time since that day, the cabin felt like what it was meant to be, a shared space, equal for everyone on board. In the months that followed, other passengers came forward with their own stories, and for once they were heard. Complaints were investigated, crew members were retrained, and slowly, the culture began to shift. It was not perfect. Change rarely is, but it was real, and it was lasting. Damien kept the boarding pass from that autumn flight in his desk drawer, a reminder that dignity in travel should not be negotiable, and that sometimes one act of standing your ground can alter the course of an entire industry. Some stories fade when the headlines do. This one cannot, because what Damien Grant endured wasn't an accident. It was the product of a system that decided who belonged and who didn't, before a single word was spoken. Yet, through composure, persistence, and truth, he turned humiliation into reform, and a single boarding pass into a bill that now protects millions. It is a reminder that respect in the air or anywhere is not a privilege. It is a right, and that the quiet courage to stand your ground can ripple farther than anger ever could. So the next time you fly, remember, every seat tells a story, and some stories can change an entire industry. If this story moved you, like it, share it, and subscribe to our channel, because the fight for dignity is far from over, and the next story we tell might just be the one that changes everything again.